Hi, I'm Alyssa Rosenberg, the host of Critic Proof and the culture blogger at Think Progress and a columnist at Slate in the Atlantic. And I'm here today with one of my favorite people to talk about pop culture with, especially when it comes to national security.
Hi, I'm Adam Serwer with Mother Jones. You may recognize me from other blogging heads shows such as Atomize. And I'm very happy to be here to talk with Alyssa, who of course is also one of my favorite people to talk pop culture with. So what are we talking about today?
Let's start talking about Homeland, which we have talked about extensively, but I want to keep talking about, especially because, for me, the show is bringing out this really interesting tension in, sort of the way that we talk about and see national security on television, which is, I think in its second season, the show remains very, very good about sort of some of the psychology of what the last decade has done to us, even as it's gotten increasingly implausible in the details of sort of how national security is conducted and the way it handles its intelligence plots. And that's something that I'm really struggling with, because I love Homeland. I like it a lot, but it's relying a lot on what I've started calling sort of Deus Ex Matheson, just all of these crazy coincidences that, I am not a national security reporter and I can see the implausibilities. And I'm struggling with that. And you wrote about that some in your review of the season.
I'm sorry, that you got fuzzed up for a second.
Oh, sure. I was just saying that, you wrote in your review about some of the implausibilities of the season, sort of from the perspective of someone who actually writes about national security, which I don't do.
Yeah, I mean, so there are a couple, there are implausibilities, and I think, obviously part of the point of a television show is not to be realistic, but to sort of use, use these stories to get at a broader point that is truthful about, society and life. And I should start off by saying I do like Homeland as like a kind of weird whodunit type show. I certainly enjoy watching it. Mm-hmm. And I like the whole conceit of the first season, which I think we've discussed, which is the sort of idea of like what does manning the ramparts do to the people who are responsible for sort of guarding us as we sleep.
Sure.
And in the case of Brody, it's sort of the Marine who is sort of turned to Al Qaeda. It's the sort of the experience of war has like turned him against the United States in a way that's sort of horrifying to imagine, right? Mm-hmm. My beef with the second season, I think, is that I think some of the implausibilities veer into into some sort of harmful areas.
Sure.
And I think, like, chiefly, what worries me about the show is, we've had this sort of minor right-wing freakout over the Obama administration supposedly being under the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood, and that's sort of ridiculous on its face, right? Like, how does the president's support for same-sex marriage work into his assistance in helping establish a global caliphate under a really strict interpretation of Islamic law? It doesn't really make sense. But at the same time, like, we've had this, Michelle Bachmann and like a bunch of her colleagues in the Republican Party in the House have been saying, these particular American Muslims are tied to the Muslim Brotherhood and they're trying to influence the government in a terrible way. And you can see how this is happening with with the U.S.'s treatment of Israel and so forth. Mm-hmm. And like, you look at the show, and there aren't actually, it is actually, to someone watching the show, it's almost like all of the Muslim characters on the show are actually kind of like secret stealth jihadists. I mean, you have Brody, of course, who's like the main character, who says, by the second season, he's like, I'm not a terrorist, I'll influence through policy, but I'm not a terrorist. But it's like, he actually already crossed that line in the first season when he flipped the switch and it didn't work. So,
sure. He kills Tom Walker to sort of help cover up the plot. He is, at minimum, a murderer.
Right. And he helped cover up the plot, but he also was willing to do it. It was by technical fluke and then like plot fluke, which Homeland uses a lot. His daughter calls him at the last minute. I think we could call that Deus Ex Dana or something like that. So you have Brody, but then you have this Palestinian or Palestinian American reporter who is also working for Al Qaeda, and she's also like she's sort of like the sort of Gaffney nightmare, so to speak. I'm referring to Frank Gaffney, who's one of the big a Republican who's one of the big sort of
nutty Islamophobes.
And she doesn't wear she doesn't wear a hijab. She's very westernized in her dress. She speaks perfect English. She flirts with the head of the CIA, but she's of course she's a spy for Al Qaeda. And there are like virtually there are almost no Muslim characters on the show who aren't really kind of evil.
I want to push back on that a little bit because, this is an area where you and I have substantial disagreement about the show. Because I do think that there are constant reminders in the show that people who assume that all Muslims are terrorists are stupid, whether it's because they interact with, whether because they interact with Muslims and things go horribly wrong because of those assumptions, or because they're sort of framed in a way that makes them look stupid. In the first season, you have this assumption that there is a mosque, Tom Walker went there, therefore those people must be terrorists because they're Muslims, and Tom Walker ran through the mosque, and a bunch of people end up dead, and it is a disaster, and Carrie, who's our heroine, gets to sort of point out what an epic, damaging, stupid fuck-up it is. This season, we have her informant who comes out of the shadows who, Carrie, meets her after morning prayers. Her head is covered. She wants to get out of an abusive marriage, but she also sort of has this long-term relationship with, sort of both Carrie and with a romanticized vision of Western culture. They get to know each other. They got to know each other, we come to understand, because they met at the movies. And her sources, in love with Julia Roberts movies. There's this sort of pushback against the idea that, sort of Western secular culture and Islam are necessarily incompatible. You've got the scene with Dana at school, who I think you pointed out that this image of sort of Quaker meeting that we have, obviously the school is meant to be sort of Sidwell Friends, where presidential daughters have gone for a long time. And you have students who are sort of echoing these talking points, including one of them who, kind of has the, Frank Gaffney, Pam Geller position that, Muslims value life differently from Westerners. And the way he's shot and the way the speech that he gives is written is meant to make him look dumb, right? He's sort of an arrogant fat boy in this school setting. He's literally in a Quaker meeting talking about turning Tehran into a parking lot. And, the show makes him look like a fool. And one of the things that I've always found really striking about the show is the way that prayer is depicted. Brody is this sort of tense, tormented figure, and the scenes where he's praying are both disconnected from the scenes where he's sort of talking about terror. The person who is repeatedly, mentioned as a motivation for him to become a terrorist is not Muhammad, it's Isa, the son of Abu Nazir, this Al-Qaeda stand-in, who was killed by a drone strike. And so there's this interesting separation between Brody's faith and his actions that I think is maybe too subtle to actually work, but that I think is intentional. In the first episode this season, Brody's wife, Jessica, finds his Quran after learning that he's actually Muslim, rips some pages out of it, throws it on the floor. And David Nevins, who's the president of Showtime, had actually recommended that scene initially involve Jessica burning the Quran. And Alex Ganza and Howard Gordon, who are the showrunners, liked the idea of a Quran being desecrated, but wanted to pull it back a little bit from that extremely inflammatory image and do something, because everyone understands if a holy book gets burned, that's a bad thing. I think it's less well known that if a Quran touches the floor that it's desecrated, that it needs to be buried. And so the show, spent the end of its first episode taking us through this relatively obscure ritual in a way that was presented, as a moment of connection between Brody and Dana, who came out to help him bury the Quran. They talked about it. His pain was, when the book was desecrated, was very, very human. And I think that the show is interesting on those details. That said, I think it could be doing better. would it be so hard to have a main character who's Muslim who is obviously not a terrorist? I don't think it would be that difficult for the show to do it, and I think it would clarify its intentions. So
I'd say a couple of things about that. There is a major figure in the CIA who is an analyst who is a devout Muslim, who is like, someone who converted, and the Washington Post did a profile of this person. And of course, this profile totally freaked out the Islamophobes, even though he was like framed as one of their top Bin Laden hunters. It was totally like, this was totally more evidence of Islamist infiltration of the Obama administration. But I will say that I just disagree with you about that scene, because you're right. I think you're right that the show tries to frame bigotry in a negative way. Like, it does try to frame people who make large generalizations about Islam as ignorant. The problem is that the actual plot of the show goes against the grain of what they're saying. Like, so Dana is sitting there, learning to admire her father's spirituality, but at the same time, her dad actually is a terrorist. And I don't think it's actually possible to separate the show's portrayal of his faith and his political conversion. And there is a separation. I mean, just in a conceptual way, there is a separation. But terrorism is not about Islam; it's about politics.
Of course.
But I don't think an audience gets that. And I don't think it's actually done well in the show to separate that out. In fact, I think it's impossible with the character that they've created to say that his conversion to Islam has nothing to do with him signing on to a political religious doctrine that is the belief of Al-Qaeda that the West and Islam are at war. Like, those two things are not, which is, conversely the same narrative that the Islamophobes put forth. Right. I don't think it's hard. I think it's really hard to separate that. And there is sort of, you mentioned the CIA asset in Lebanon who is married to a Hezbollah brigade commander who informs the CIA about this meeting between her husband and Abu Nazir, who's sort of the terrorist mastermind, the Dr. Moriarty of the show. But, even she, I think, I find her character a little problematic because, you're right, she's not a bad person, but in the sense that she's not exactly much more than a plot device either, and not just a plot device, but a plot for, she's sort of a tool of characterization.
Sure.
In the sense that when you referred earlier to the fact that people who are, prejudiced towards Muslims are coded as sort of evil on the show. Mm-hmm. In that same way, Carrie's relationships with Muslims on the show are a way to code her as a good guy. Sure. She's left the CIA, but she now teaches English to Arabic speakers who presumably are recent immigrants to the United States, or the children of recent immigrants to the United States. She has this connection with this woman, but the big, I think that's largely her purpose, is not just a plot device to get Carrie back to working with the CIA, but to sort of show that Carrie is like this awesome person who also doesn't hate Muslims. And at the same time, let's be honest. I mean, like, this is still not exactly. This is still a fairly negative portrayal of Muslim society, in the sense that she is trying to escape an abusive marriage to a violent militant Islamist husband. And I'm not against like negative portrayals of Islam on TV or whatever. Like, in general, like I think every religion deserves to be criticized. But I am saying that I do think that the breadth of the portrayal of Muslims on the show, for a show that is essentially about the kind of Al-Qaeda style terrorism that the United States, the threat of Al-Qaeda style terrorism that the United States faces, it is sort of startling for its absence of Muslim characters who are not either really sort of useful only for deepening the characterization of non-Muslim characters, or they're bad guys. That's all I'd say about that.
If I can loop back for one more second, then we can move on to some
Sure.
of the other crazy implausibilities. I agree with you on that to a certain extent. And I feel like this becomes a situation where the show does something that I think is really useful, which is that even people, even a character like the informant who, is a small character, she is there to get Carrie back into the CIA.
Mm-hmm.
she's given a number of motivations and, sort of personality characteristics, right? I mean, the Julia Roberts movies line is, right. It's a total throwaway line. It didn't even have to be there, but it's a nice little bit of characterization. They make her a person, right? I mean, she
sort of. It also expresses her longing, the longing of Muslim women for Western society. Was how I interpreted that. It reminds me of the sort of like mutilated women on time covers type thing. Sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No. I mean, but I think this is a challenge, right? I mean, like, I don't think that's like, I don't think it's invalid for the show to have a position that, like, Carrie is a better person than, say, David Estes, who's super cavalier about the drone program, because, she is genuinely interested in the Muslim world. I don't think it's a bad thing to, have part of Dana's political consciousness be that, Islam is interesting and that, she is drawn to people from another part of the world. But it's really hard to have those be positive character traits and to do them well. I think it's, I don't want to over-interrogate that as a bit of signaling, such that we suggest it's a bad thing to do, if that makes any sense, right? I mean, I think, again, this is a show that if it had, I think if Saul was Muslim, if Virgil was Muslim, if we had, one person who, gets to be full and weird and, rich and interesting and clearly good, that would mitigate some of these problems. It would bring sort of more of a balance to the show. But, like, I can't really complain about, Carrie being interested in, people who speak Arabic and are, interested in a rapprochement between, Islam and the West. I can't really, at the end of the day, see that as a bad thing for the show.
No, it's not a bad thing. I just wish there was more depth to the characters, the Muslim characters on the show who are not terrorists. And I think, my favorite character on the show, and I think Carrie is great, but my favorite character on the show, and maybe my favorite character on television right now, is Mandy Patinkin's Saul Berenson, who is sort of character.
You're the beard.
Yeah, I mean, he's fantastic. So he's Matheson's sort of CIA mentor. But like, I absolutely love the way that his Jewish identity is like weaved into the story of the show. Like, it's like something that is like a very important part of his characterization, but it's also not. He's also not like completely defined by it. It's something that deepens his character. There's that amazing sort of moment where he. Which is sort of like the anti-24 interrogation scene in the first season, where he talks about his experience of assimilation as a Jewish person in order to crack a woman who is a sort of Jihad Jane type woman who is a white woman who American woman who's converted to Islam and sort of become radicalized. That's like one of my favorite scenes, in the show, and one of my, I really, really enjoyed it. But I also like my larger critique of the show. I think, as far as like this whole issue of like what the war on terror does to us, and I think, I think the show wants to do more with that than it's actually doing. And when I think about as far as like I can remember, the ballsiest show about the war on terror that's ever been made is Battlestar Galactica. I think because
have you seen Sleeper Cell?
I have not seen Sleeper Cell.
I would love for you to watch Sleeper Cell, if only because the main character, played by Michael Ealy, is a Muslim FBI agent who's sent in to infiltrate a sleeper cell.
Oh, that does sound interesting. It sounds a little bit like the movie Traitor with Don Cheadle that came out a while ago, which I believe, I have this conspiracy theory that it's based off of Ali Soufan, the Muslim FBI agent who has become so prominent as a critic of torture over the past couple of years, but I don't actually have any factual basis for that. But I just mean that in terms of it's hard for me to buy Brody's criticisms of the American national security state, in part because he actually is a terrorist. Whereas you look at what Battlestar Galactica did, which is, it wasn't justifying terrorism, it was just putting the viewer in a very uncomfortable emotional position where they might actually identify with terrorists, which is just that's a really ballsy thing to do. And I think sometimes, I think it sort of got criticized at the time for justifying terrorism, and I don't think that's what it was attempting to do. It was attempting to force the viewer to fight their own feelings about wanting to be sympathetic with extremists. And I think that Homeland sort of wants to do that by trying to make Brody a understandable, likable character, and but using the death of this child as his motivation for his political conversion. But I just don't think it's quite gotten there yet.
I agree with you that it doesn't quite stick the landing on that. And I think part of the problem is that Issa isn't really a person in the first season. We see him only in flashbacks. And I actually thought the most sort of successful invocation of him was this season when Roya, this journalist, shows up in his office and, says to him, remember Issa, he would have been 13. Do you remember what you gave him for his birthday? He was afraid of the big blackbirds on the fence. You gave him a slingshot. It was this sort of detailed little story about sort of what they'd meant to each other. And it's hard to conjure someone who's dead via flashback. And I think that, because we just haven't spent that much time with Brody. And I also think, some of this is cinematography too, right? I mean, the way that Brody is shot, coming out of his cell for the first time in captivity, and there's just this warm light and very sort of beautiful old architecture, and the first thing he sees is men at prayer, and it's this, it's this beautiful revelatory little bit of cinematography, and nothing with Issa has sort of any of that quality of framing or camera work at all.
It's not quite clear what he meant to Brody. We know Brody really cared about him, but we don't exactly have an understanding of his emotional journey. And I think for that reason, it sort of, I think for some people it comes off as trite. Why is it that this person who's a Marine who's seen an incredible amount of death and violence is, why does this straw break, the back of break him, so to speak? And I don't think the show is quite explained. It has quite convinced me that of how realistic that is yet within the context of the character.
Well, and I think they maybe could have done something either narrower or broader, right? I mean, this could have been a psychological portrait of a suicide bomber who is essentially suicidal. And where that's not the politics, but a suicidal ideation is what's driving him, right? Because I think there is. There is a powerful examination to be done about sort of grief and drones and the war on terror. And if it had been more narrowly focused, you might have a really interesting arc where Brody is suicidal, almost commits suicide, and sort of rediscovers the will to live, and then is pulled back in because there's this martyr tape that he could be blackmailed with. I think that if they'd gone sort of narrower and more psychological, that might have been one way that had worked. Or if they had done a broader story where we saw him spending more time with Nazir and where there was an actual political argument made, and that was, where they spent, say they had 5 or 6 extra episodes, and we actually saw Brody spend time in Nazir's camp, saw him undergo a political conversion, if there was sort of a balance between the two homelands.
I think you may have hit on what I think is problematic is that we don't see we assume the religious conversion is the political conversion.
Right.
And because we see Brody doing things like reading the Quran, and all of a sudden he's a terrorist. You know what I mean? It's just Sorry, that's all I was going to say.
No, I just think because I think that the show is strongest when it is about sort of grief and doubt and disappointment, and that's what I thought makes sort of the second episode, and we're airing this after the second episode has aired, so we can spoil away. There's this amazing scene where Carrie is talking to Saul on the roof, and she just says, it fucked me up. It really fucked me up being wrong. I've never been so sure about anything. And, this is a pattern that we've seen with her, where in the first season, she talks about having missed something before September 11th, or even on the day of. And Saul sort of tells her, not everyone, everybody missed something that day. All of us missed something that day. And she just says, not me, I don't miss things. And, this is someone who is, grieving for an act of terror that she feels really personally responsible for. And that is an interesting position to explore, right? I mean, much of our conversation about, September 11th in a political context has been about the failure to heed warnings, the failure on the sort of political level to act. but we haven't had as much of either a political conversation or a cultural conversation about what it meant to be one of the people giving warnings and to be ignored and to feel sort of powerless as something like this that you feel responsible for happens. I mean, I imagine that there are people who feel unbelievable sort of grief and rage and tension over September 11th in a really personal way that, I mean, I just can't even fathom, you know? And it, you know, seeing Carrie be just sort of utterly destroyed twice by this is so difficult. And I think that if the halves of the show sort of matched in these, you know, very careful psychological portraits, it might be a better show, if that makes any sense.
Well, I do think the point you made about some of the sort of national security types being coded as bad and the ones and some being coded as good, and like I think the distinction it really is politics, right? I mean, Carrie is destroyed because she feels like she's responsible for she feels some level of responsibility for failing to prevent the attacks on September 11th, and she feels like and part of what literally drove her out of her mind in the first season of the show is that she's worried about something like that happening again. Whereas like with the guys who are coded as bad, with like Estes and the vice president, there's like a sense that this is really about politics for them, and not and not necessarily about it's not the sort of desire to protect the country is not as purely altruistic as Carrie's desire is. And I think and we can see that in the way that she is like literally just destroyed by her pursuit of Brody. But I think that is one of the more effective parts of the show.
Yeah, I mean, the war on terror has literally driven her insane,
right.
And it's part of what's really interesting is at the end of the second episode is seeing Saul, and I hate the way that Saul gets his hands on this piece of information. Carrie, after extricating her source, sort of runs through her husband's house, grabs a bunch of documents.
That's a fantastically shot scene, by the way.
It's a fantastically shot scene that makes no sense, right? I mean, it is a total...
It doesn't make sense that Carrie ends up with the piece of evidence that she ends up with at all. But it does. But like as a like suspenseful scene, like one of the things that Homeland does really well, and I think that like makes it feel more realistic than other shows, is that there are no like real spy superheroics. When Carrie sort of is disabling her pursuers, so to speak, she does it in like eminently
she needs them in the balls, right? Like I mean, that's
realistic ways. Like she doesn't do any like Jason Bourne type shit. She literally just does small things that you can imagine her being capable of doing.
Yeah. But no, so there's this, I mean, so at the end of the second episode, Saul, however ridiculous it is that he gets his hand on this, this flashcard that has a copy of Brody's martyrdom video on it. Part of what's really fascinating about that is that it both proves that Carrie was right. And in a way, but like the timing doesn't matter, right? It's this incredibly sort of irrelevant thing that serves only to like, it can restore a little bit of her sanity, but it's almost the equivalent of her taking her lithium, right? It's something that will provide something of a corrective, but cannot cure sort of the larger madness, Well,
I'm interested to see how because like one of the challenges for the show, I think, is like how do they drag the mystery of Brody out for another season? and I'm interested to see how they do that.
I did an interview with Alex Ganza and Howard Gordon, and I don't know what will happen, but I published this a couple weeks ago, but they said that the political story of the show will no longer be in play, or we'll see what the endgame could be around season 5, so I'm actually not sure we're going to see sort of a full season of dragging out the mystery of Brody. And I think that has to do with some trends in pay cable television anyway, where resolutions or sort of big events are starting to move away from the final episode of seasons and into sort of penultimate episodes or halfway through. There was a big dramatic death on Sons of Anarchy in the third or fourth episode this season. Game of Thrones for 2 seasons in a row has not had its climactic events in the last season. And so, I'm not sure that I'm not sure the show is going to need to stretch Brody out for another 6 or 7 episodes, but I could be wrong.
Well, we should probably transition into Last Resort, or is it Scandal that we're talking about?
Yeah, let's talk about, well, because one of the things that I find really interesting about this year, I mean, obviously we've talked about Homeland a lot, and it's an important, influential show, but we also have two sort of sophisticated network shows, both on ABC, that are doing big national security storylines this year. And the first one is Last Resort, which is Sean Ryan, who created The Shield and Terriers, doing a story about a crew of a nuclear submarine who get caught up in a conspiracy, flee to a Pacific island, and set themselves up as their own country. And I've watched the first two episodes, and I mean, the show has to me this core problem that The Dark Knight Rises has, right? Which is, the United States has a lot of commandos and a pretty good military, and the chances of it letting people just sort of hang around with nuclear weapons for a while seems relatively unlikely to me.
It's like a combination between like nuclear Waco, and Gilligan's Island.
Yeah.
Like, it's very extra. It's kind of like so I don't think the show works without Andre Braugher, because he gives gravity to like the most ridiculous shit.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, he's just like fun to watch in anything, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's just an incredible actor, and he just has a way of making like this like fairly ridiculous like premise seem really serious.
Right. Everything seems credible when Andre Braugher says it.
Right. Even though like you're thinking about it and you're like, there's just no, I mean, like it's sort of a very silly concept for a show. That said, I actually enjoyed it.
Yeah.
It's very like I mean, I can't. I want to see where it goes, but I sort of I'm not really sure what the politics of the show are. I mean, it's very sort of like a combination of sort of lefty anti-war stuff and like libertarianish, like our government used to be awesome, but now it's totally big and corrupt type stuff.
It also has Autumn Reeser, who played Lizzie Grant on Entourage, as a sexy defense contractor, who is kind of heroic, but maybe also evil. It's a little too early to tell. What we do know is that she apparently gets off by naming weapon specs as she is taking congressional staffers to bed. That is the main thing we know about her.
She gets sex posited in the first scene we see her in.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like this is a case where the sex position, like the sex and the position, are actually woven together. It's not like she's talking about this at a strip club where like prostitutes are having lesbian sex in the background. So it's a minor networks friendly step up from Game of Thrones.
Right. But it's also, she's in control of the situation, so it's very different. Like she's she's obviously she's totally in control of the entire encounter. She's like literally physically on top in the shop, but then when she gets a call to go to work, she's like, all right, peace. I have something more important to do. And the guy's like, well, are you going to leave me here? I mean, like, it's a role reversal of the usual sex position, gender roles.
Right. I mean, I don't know if you've watched Entourage, but I basically think she is Lizzie Grant, who is the super agent who worked for Ari and got fired. I totally do
that with shows. I like to think, like when I watch Fringe, I like to think that Lieutenant Daniels, after leaving the Baltimore police force, then became the head of the Fringe division of the FBI or whatever. Like I totally do that with actors who play similar characters on different shows.
But this is like super plausible because it's all the same skills. It's like her being super sexy and tough, and like clearly she left Los Angeles and went to become a defense contractor by I think her name is the like romance novel-tastic Kylie St. Clair.
Right.
Which I mean, like,
well, the whole show is romance novel-tastic.
Yes. Yeah, and it's got so many tropes in it. It has the like. I don't know if you knew this, but there is a whole genre of like Marines and Navy SEALs romance novels, of which I have read a number because I'm a terrible person.
I was not aware of this.
Yes, this is like an entire separate genre. Nick Bauman, your colleague at Mother Jones, was the person who alerted me to this and also gave me my first one. So shout out to Nick Bauman for that. Purveyor of, Navy SEAL smut. But yeah, so you have these like hunky, SEAL teams who, are also really wounded and vulnerable and like crying and being comforted by gorgeous biracial women at South Pacific bars. I mean, it's got pretty much
from Dollhouse, no less.
Yes. Yes. So it's a super weird, in a way, it's like super old fashioned, right? It's, military men doing the right thing. It's like World War II, but with more computers. But it's a really weird show. And I can't quite decide what I think about the scenario that the sub team got themselves in trouble with, which is that they were commanded to nuke Pakistan for no apparent reason by a cabal that's taken over the government, or so we think. And it's one of those things where I think, like, the prospect of nuclear war in Pakistan is a really interesting thing for a show to explore. It's I think a reasonably logical flashpoint potentially, or at least a setting for a loose nuke story. But like, why would even a sort of rogue, nutty cabal in the U.S. government want us to nuke Peshawar? I don't get it.
Well, I don't see. I think like so like this show is like totally on the other side of the shark or whatever. But
yeah.
I think the purpose of Pakistan is in the show is really just. I mean, like it's sort of fucked up in a way, but I think the whole purpose is to set up this ethical dilemma where it's like you expect people in the military to follow orders when they're given.
Yeah.
But this is like the worst possible order you can imagine, which is to obliterate, millions and millions of people. And he says, I'm gonna check before I do this one. And when as his sort of suspicions are confirmed that this isn't really, this isn't really what it seems to be, he doesn't do it. And I think it's like one of those moments where it's sort of hard to, like, it's sort of hard to hope that if you're in a situation where, like, it's a sort of grafting of the old Cold War, Soviet Union, United States, like mutual annihilation situation, except in this case it's pretty one-sided. But, I mean, you sort of hope that if there was a situation in which the world was itself about to be plunged into nuclear war, your last hope might reside on the consciences of the two people on either side whose job it is to turn those keys and launch a nuclear weapon. And I think that's sort of like a cool ethical concept to insert into the show. But I don't even know, like, I'm not even sure that, I'm not even sure that Pakistan matters or is considered really deeply by the show at all as anything more than just like, well, we think Pakistan is a scary country, so.
Don't you think the show sort of punts on that ethical dilemma a little bit? Because, what happens but I guess I think it punts by setting up this situation where the orders are obviously bogus, right? Because what happens if, Captain Marcus calls for confirmation of the orders that he's gotten through this, second sort of secondary sketchy channel that's only supposed to use if the government's decapitated? What if he gets through to the White House and the president's like, yeah, nuke them some bitches? And that doesn't happen in the show, right? He just gets relieved of command,
right.
The orders keep coming through the secondary channel. And so it's sort of assumed that, the moral dilemma is all contingent on this sort of sketchy coup in Washington, which 2 episodes in, we have no idea what's going on there. Like, we know that people are protesting the president's policies and quitting things, but we have no idea what's going on there. And so it's all sort of contingent. The moral dilemma is contingent on a conspiracy theory.
Yeah, I mean, it's... Right, so I think that the idea that the order is obviously not coming from the right people, makes it an easier call for the audience. That you know what I'm saying? Like, obviously the audience is like, yeah, dude, you really shouldn't turn that key. But I think, I think that's just one of those. I think my expectations, for complex ethical dilemmas on this show are actually like much lower from Homeland. For say Homeland, and like I'm therefore much more forgiving of the fact that this actually seems like an easier call than it is, because I don't think it's actually trying to make us think too deeply about it. It's just using this as a premise for like this high concept that they've developed.
One of the things I thought was interesting about the second episode of the show, which aired on Thursday, is that it has this plot where Marcus and company think that a team of U.S. commandos has arrived on the island and is going to take them out and take control back of nuclear weapons, which, if I were president of the United States, would probably be something I would try, unlike the president in Dark Knight Rises.
I mean, can you imagine the political shitstorm facing a president. I mean, could you?
Unbelievable.
I mean, like,
unbelievable.
we get. I mean, like, Obama was in seriously deep shit when a wannabe terrorist tried to explode a plane and set himself on fire and got subdued by the unarmed passengers on the plane. Can you imagine if, like, some rogue faction of the U.S. military absconded and created their own little, like, independent republic or whatever, armed with nuclear missiles? I mean, like, it would be, like, you'd have to resign. You'd be impeached. They would toss you out on your ass.
You would probably have to commit seppuku. I mean,
right. Yes. I mean, like, on television, on C-SPAN, you'd walk into the Capitol and then you'd disembowel yourself in front of the entire country.
Right. And, like, you'd be like, I'm really, really sorry. Your wife and children would be, like, throwing rotten vegetables at you while you did it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, anyway, they think that's what's happening, which would be the logical, sensible thing to do. But instead, they basically go into this plot that's like, oh, we wish we had the Cold War back. Because it turns out to be Russian commandos who are like, hey, we'd like one of those nifty cloaked nuclear subs. It might be easier to steal it than to develop the technology ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so it ends up being this, like, wacky Cold War story where Marcus, like, calls up an old friend of his who's, who's, like, the head of the Russian Navy, and basically says, I'll nuke your sons in Siberia, leave me alone, you go talk to the Secretary of the Navy, I'm going to drink some rum. It's this weird commentary on the fact that action movies have never really gotten over the end of the Cold War, right? I mean, it's this thing that we still wish was happening.
The Cold War is a force that gives us meaning.
Right, and
so we sort of graft the ethics of the Cold War onto basically every international conflict that we deal with.
Right. And I mean, it's absolutely true that the Cold War gives us meaning in sort of a geopolitical, moral sense, but also just from a narrative sense. The Ruskies are great villains, right? Like, you have the, awesome, evil, like, scary, lesbian-coded Russian spies in Bond movies. You have, these, and you even have this reference. Actually, now that I think about it, like, longing for the Cold War is a big theme of Last Resort, because in the first episode, Marcus is having a drink in his stateroom with Scott Speedman, his XO, whose name I can never remember because he's bland and blonde and Scott Speedman. But, and he tells the story about sort of Reagan firing the air traffic controllers in part as a way to communicate to the Russians that he might be crazy and he might do anything.
Right.
And
the old Reagan quote.
Exactly. Like, there's just this incredible nostalgia for, both the clarity of that conflict and, the narrative clarity and value of that conflict. And the whole show is just a weird comment on, oh my god, it was so easier when deterrence was our only problem.
I mean, the irony, of course, is that the world is a lot less dangerous now that the Soviet Union isn't around anymore.
Right. No, of course. I mean, without question. But it is a very, very interesting...
But there was a moral clarity to that. Where,
right.
Like, I think people are very nostalgic for that, and you can see it superimposed on the Islam thing when people try to elevate Al-Qaeda to the status of the Soviet Union as a threat, or Iran. It's just like there's this definite nostalgia for a period where, like, for some people, the lines of right and wrong,
when there was an actual evil empire, right? That there was a war that could be fought according to the laws of war and nuclear deterrence. And I think that
and everybody forgets the whole perched on the like edge of annihilation thing that involves that sort of high-level confrontation between two nuclear powers.
Right. Because as risky as it was, we have in our imagination the idea that it was easier to deal with, that, there was an arms race, but things were basically equal. I think we have this idea that the Cold War, was kind of a time of stasis instead of something that we were constantly sort of manipulating, to keep sort of balanced and stable. And
of course people were getting told all over the world. I mean, it was cold. We never invaded Russia or vice versa, but there were proxy conflicts all over the planet.
Right, and all of a sudden we have to start focusing on these sort of intractable, nasty, permanent little wars of our own making, and those aren't fun. They don't end. Nobody comes home covered in glory. There is no cause. They just are, miserable and grinding and partially our own fault. And, neither narratively nor emotionally is that appealing subject material. So it's very interesting to see Last Resort try and sort of
I think it's like, and you can see this, I think,
clock.
in the fact that no one's made a really successful, fictional show about Iraq yet.
Yeah.
It's just, it's too soon or whatever, in the emotional sense. Like, people would rather think about things in more black and white terms.
But I also think people don't know what the narrative is, right? Like, we didn't win. We don't have moral clarity about it. We're not sure how to define who or what we're fighting.
Mm.
The most interesting fiction that I've read about the war in Iraq is this book called The Mirage by an author, Matt Ruff, who's since become a friend. And it's this really interesting sort of alternate history. The idea is that there's a United Arab States that has been the world power essentially since the 30s. The United States is this wasteland overrun by warlords, including David Koresh, who runs a bunch of Texas. Osama bin Laden is the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee in the sort of democratic government that runs the UAS. And it's really, you sort of flip it around and there's no more sort of clarity from that perspective either. It's just a situation that is, it's, I'm trying to think, it's not a bipolar, because it's not a bipolar world, no matter how you slice it. Mm-hmm. There's no available grand struggle narrative or moral clarity.
Well, I think it's also problematic because I think most people realize the Iraq War was a mistake, and we don't really like thinking about our mistakes in that context, particularly ones as big as that.
Yeah. No, and that actually brings us to the third show we were going to discuss, which is Scandal, Shonda Rhimes' show about a political fixer based on Judy Smith with Kerry Washington in the lead role, which this season has been, in its 2 episodes in, has been dealing with, among many other scandalous, ridiculous things, has been dealing with a push to get the president, Fitzgerald Grant, to intervene in a ongoing genocide in a fictional country. It's, I guess, East Sudan, I think that's what they're calling it. And in this week's episode, it's both a sort of semi-forward-looking conflict. It's, it is sort of Arab Springy. It's like we have warships off the coast.
It's sort of a Libya proxy.
Exactly. But it also has, this week, had the question of whether we were being pushed into a war there by faked intelligence, which I thought was sort of an interesting way of looking back on the war in Iraq with an entirely new scenario. It's like, let's take one element of this and mash it up with a different kind of conflict and see what we get. And I don't think Scandal is very good. I sometimes think it's fun. But I actually thought I didn't expect that plot line to even last 2 episodes, and I'm kind of surprised by how much I like it, even if I think it's playing out in a really silly way.
Mm-hmm. Well, Scandal's kind of a silly show, but so what's weird about Scandal is I'm a huge Kerry Washington fan as well. But she's she has to be speaking of favorite characters on television, she has to be my favorite Republican on television. She's the most liberal Republican ever, but whatever.
Well, it's also just nice to have a show that names its characters' political parties, right?
Yeah, I think that's actually kind of brave. Yeah. Because a lot of times shows try to avoid stuff like that.
Especially since Shonda Rhimes' core audience is, women and women of color. It's an interesting decision. But,
right. She's a black woman who is also Republican, and the character she's based off of, I don't know if she's Republican or not. But
I don't think Judy has clear politics.
Right.
She wrote Monica Lewinsky. She's sort of all over the place.
But it's definitely, that Washington Post profile is fascinating because it's sort of this is a show about someone you've never heard of who's participated in some of the most prominent political stories of the past 20 years. But it's sort of interesting because she's a Republican, the character's a Republican, but the show has obviously liberal politics. The first episode is about a war hero in the closet whose like alibi for murdering his girlfriend is the fact that he was actually out with his boyfriend that night.
Yeah.
And at the end of the episode, he's like, he's like publicly coming out and being like, I'm proud and like blah, 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 blah. And she's like she's totally supportive of this. And she's like, no, you have to come out. I mean, and I think like she says in a subsequent episode, they're like, there's a whole scandal involving a potential Supreme Court nominee. Mm-hmm. And he's like very sympathetic because he's conservative, but he's not like a religious right person. You know what I mean? Like there's like a way in which the show is like very clearly being like, okay, these are Republicans, but they're Republicans you can like.
Well, and it's also super tied up with Shonda Rhimes' sort of key concern, which, as my friend Willa Paskin has pointed out, like Shonda's obsessed with the role of the mistress in sort of American culture and in American life. And so, a lot of the show is concerned with sort of Washington's sexual ethics. So the Supreme Court nominee story, it turns out that like his wife, before she knew him, worked as an escort for a while. And it was for the purest of motivations. Kerry Washington's character herself, Olivia Pope, is the former mistress of the president because, as we all know, powerful political figures.
That is just like that is just talk about your romance novel stuff.
Yeah,
like it's those scenes are so funny. I mean, I know they're not. I mean, I think they're supposed to be like silly, but they're so funny to watch.
Yeah, well, and it's like,
and they're well acted. Like Kerry Washington's a great actress. It's just like when you're watching, like, there's just no way to have like a scene between like the handsome young president and his like gorgeous ex-lover and like their sexual tension without like feeling really silly.
Yeah, and the fact that he like keeps calling her on the phone, which is part of this week's episode, it's like, I mean,
even by the terms of the show, this would have blown up already. Like in the universe the show is in, like Kerry Washington's character would have had to call someone else to help her out.
Right. Well, and the president's like gay Republican chief of staff knows about this. Like everybody knows. The president's wife knows. Like, I mean, it's really funny. It's really, really funny.
But it's like there's a way in which shows like that. I mean, like I don't think the show takes itself too seriously in that regard.
No.
You know what I mean? Like it's a very fun sort of mystery of the week show that has like, these really sort of silly over the top elements, but it's not like bad because it's not taking itself too seriously.
Well, to take us full circle though, one part of the show that does take itself very seriously is this character Huck, played by Guillermo Diaz, who spent a bunch of time apparently torturing people for the CIA before Olivia hired him. And there's this scene last season where he's like literally drilling a hole in a guy to get information out of him. And it's like, the scene itself is like weird and very intense. It's almost like sexual or a drug binge or something. And the character goes to Alcoholics Anonymous this week and like uses like whiskey as a stand-in for torture and like says that he's an alcoholic, and what he's talking about is actually like, cutting people up and doing terrible things to them. And I think the character is meant to be, again, this commentary on like the war on terror and the things that we ask people to do for us and how it injures them. But he kind of sounds like a serial killer.
Right.
And I feel like I shouldn't be laughing about it. I feel really bad, right? Like, Guillermo Diaz is a good actor and has been given these lines that make him sound kind of goofy, but that's something that's really interesting. It's like, we ask people to waterboard people and to do other terrible things to them. How are those people holding up? That is an interesting question to me. I mean...
They got promoted, most of them. I mean...
But how are they dealing with it internally? Like, the people who actually did the work.
Yeah, I'd say the most unrealistic thing about it is that he somehow had to leave his job instead of getting...
Right. No, I mean, but I'm
he should have... I mean, like, in real life, that kind of guy, like, writes a best-selling book and gets to go on Fox News every other day.
Yeah, I mean, and I think one of the things that's interesting about the show is that, like, this is a character who's very, very obviously damaged. And Olivia basically asks him to, like, break his torture sobriety to torture someone in the first season. And that is an awful thing to do, and the character has not been held accountable for it at all.
Right. I mean, so that's the other interesting thing about the show is that it sort of has, like, a liberal political sensibility. But I'm not actually sure sometimes that I'm supposed to be rooting for her.
Yeah.
Like, I think in some ways what they do is fundamentally unethical. Like, their attempt to, like, shield powerful people from public accountability is actually, like just goes against my, my moral instincts as a journalist. Like, it's hard, it's like, it's actually, I find myself watching the show and being like, well, why the fuck shouldn't people know that? Like, that people have a right to know that. And so it's like, it's sometimes hard for me, I think, to actually like root for the characters on the show for that reason.
Well, and it's an interesting show, right? I mean, I've been thinking about this and sort of in the context of Homeland and some other shows, and we've sort of overused the term anti-hero to mean any character who's sort of dark or morally conflicted in any way, instead of to mean someone who is just like a straight-up bad person who you should not root for, but you do anyway because they are sort of competent or interesting or sociopathically charming.
They have some sort of redeeming quality that is not necessarily, that can be a morally neutral one.
Well, and it lets you exercise sort of an out on exacting moral judgment on them. And I think, in a way, like, someone like Carrie Matheson from Homeland has been treated as if she's an anti-hero, when really she's not, right? She wants to do good things. She wants to protect the United States of America, but the way that she does that is bad and often gets her in trouble. It's almost an inverse of the anti-hero. Her intentions are good, but the fact that she's sort of a screw-up and breaks the law and is flagrantly crazy makes us doubt her goodness. I think Olivia Pope is maybe the closest we have to, like, a real-life female anti-hero on television. You know, even someone like Patty Hughes on Damages essentially, like, wants to protect people from large corporations and does evil things to do it. But Olivia wants to do something that is on a certain level fundamentally really bad, which is shield people from consequences.
Right.
She's
rich and powerful people often from consequences.
Right. And she's very good at it, but the show keeps pulling back from it, right? Like, the people she wants to protect turn out to be innocent in some way, or, you know, there was an
That's how it solves the problem of what she does is actually kind of fundamentally unethical.
Right, but there was an episode last season where she backed off of representing a privileged boy who'd raped somebody, and, you know, I wish the show, in a way, would, like, let her go full anti-hero and just trust that, like, Kerry Washington is one of the most beautiful women on earth. She wears a great wardrobe. She delivers the sort of snappy Shonda dialogue really perfectly. She's super competent. Like, even the president wants to fuck her, right? Like, she is just so cool. And I wish that they would let her be a little bit more evil and, you know, rely on the other stuff to sort of, you know, the fact that there are still people rooting for Walter White, who has murdered people and raped his wife and, you know, is abusive and horrible and almost killed a child because he's so awesome. Like, can't we let Kerry Washington be, like, evil in a way that's actually realistic and happens and has consequences in Washington, D.C., and, you know, and ride along as a character on the strength of her awesome, which is pretty considerable. I mean, I think that would be a much more interesting show to me.
I think it also can't be underestimated, or it can't go unremarked upon, rather, that she is one of the most interesting black women characters on television. She doesn't have a family. She's not married. You know what I mean?
And she doesn't appear to have, like, parents or an extended family who are part of her life either.
Right. I mean, I hope that the show does not entirely excise that kind of context. I mean, I would like to see, like, where she grew up, how that shaped how her life was shaped. Yeah. But I do worry about television's the racial composition of, like, television writers sometimes worries me as to, like, how how well that could be portrayed and handled. But I you know, the show is good enough that I think it could do that. But I just think it's interesting because I can't think of a whole lot of shows. There aren't a whole lot of shows popping off the top of my head in which the protagonist is a black woman whose major character trait is, like, her professional talents. Yeah. In fact, I can't think of any off the top of my head right now. Yeah. And I think, like, the show's, like, groundbreaking in that sense. Also because she, like, fundamentally deviates from the, like, honorable victim narrative of black women that you often see on television. And I just think that in and of itself is, like, brave and awesome, even though the show is, like, morally questionable, ethically questionable in other ways.
Well, and we're going to get another show like that in January. Megan Good is in Infamous, this NBC drama that is sort of like Scandal meets Revenge. She's playing a, like, super competent black cop who grew up in the household of a wealthy white family as the daughter of the housekeeper, and was best friends with the daughter, had a love affair with the younger son, and as an adult, her friend is murdered, and she's basically brought in to go undercover with the family and find out what went on. And I mean, even Revenge has this Ashley character who is, sort of black, socially striving, again, very sort of professionally defined, but allowed to be, like, super competent and socially interesting and manipulative. And so, we'll see how all of these shows do long term. Shonda can keep stuff on the air for a long time. She's one of the only women of color in Hollywood who can do something like that. But it would be neat to see Infamous and Ashley's character on Revenge get some traction too. Progress in television is always really slow. Numbers can go up dramatically one year and down dramatically the next if the one show that employed a lot of women or people of color is canceled. Mm. But to have, these 3 shows on 2 different networks is, hopefully a little bit promising. So,
right, and I do think that Scandal ultimately will have, like, a salutary effect on people's understanding of whether or not you can cast people of color in central roles that are generally outside the box of what you expect black characters to be. And so I like it for that reason.
Yeah. Well, and I feel a little bit the same way about Last Resort, which, sorry, my brain is breaking. Andre Braugher, his sort of defining role before this is Detective Pembleton on Homicide, who, in his own way, is, kind of a groundbreaking black man. He is, he's more educated than the other detectives. He's something of a dandy. He's a perfectionist. He kind of works alone. But it's nice to see him in Last Resort get to be in command. He's not answering to anybody. The sort of onus to create a more perfect society on this little island and to make national security decisions now that it's an independent nation sort of all rest on him. He's basically a black president without being a black president on the show. And, he's a black president who's, resisted orders from the largely white government of the United States and is, like, making a go of it on his own and is presented as, essentially fundamentally trustworthy, which is, an interesting framing. And Brower does not like to talk about race in his career. Like, really, really, really minimized a question about that at the Television Critics Association press tour in July. But I still think it's an interesting role.
Well, I think so. Not to take away from Brower, who, like I said, I'm a huge fan. But I think that I think his role is, like, a lot less groundbreaking in the sense that the black military man is something that has been paved, I think, before. I think back to, like, almost, in some cases, almost to the point of stereotype. Like, I think back to the sergeant in Aliens. Yeah. The cigar-chomping sergeant in Aliens. He was cool, but then, like, everybody started wanting to do that. And like, this is the danger, right, with characters of colors, that when they work, you see a lot of, like all of a sudden, the entertainment
repetition, not a lot of innovation.
Right. You see a lot of clones of the same character, like, popping out. But, I think with the sort of, black military man character, like, obviously Cisco on Deep Space Nine is the sort of, like, completely paved the way for the, like, super competent, black leader. In a military context. I guess Starfleet's... I'm not the biggest Star Trek person, but I understand Starfleet has to be military, right? Or it's, like, some sort of weird combination of, like, military... Like, if you melded the military
it's like
and the State
peacekeeping and exploration. Together. It's basically peacekeeping and exploration. It's like NATO.
Yeah.
As I understand it.
It's so, like, I think you had, like, his role... Brower's role in the show is, like, I think less groundbreaking, but we'll see where they take it. Less groundbreaking as compared to, like, Kerry Washington on Scandal.
I guess the one thing I would say about both of them is that they are people of color whose moral judgment, the show frames that you are expected to trust without sort of intervention or validation by white people. Mm-hmm. And I do think that is, happening to different extents on each show, but I think that is interesting and important for both of them. Mm-hmm. So, it's it's interesting. It's an interesting fall. I think we're basically out of time, but thank you so much for.
Well, thank you for having me, and of course,
on.
this is a special birthday edition. So happy birthday, Alyssa!
Thanks, I appreciate it. And you should, we need to check back in at the end of the second season of Homeland and see what's happened.
Yeah, I'm hoping they'll take it someplace more interesting than I think it's gone in the first 2 episodes, but we'll see.
Fingers crossed. We'll have to see. Thank you so much, Adam.
All right, thank you.